Hello, today is Friday, June 14th, and welcome to episode 348 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI's Deputy Executive Director, Jessica Jones, and today I'm joined by two NSI Senior Fellows, Les Munson and glutton for punishment, Bishop Garrison, who, if you guys aren't watching on, you need to see, he's got his Fun Friday shirt on, so he's ready for today's episode. Today we're talking about, and I love saying this, a flotilla of Russian ships, which includes a nuclear-powered submarine that arrived in Havana earlier this week. The U.S. and Canada have been monitoring Russian activity by sea and air as the ships have made their way to Cuba. They did drills in the Atlantic, practicing with high-precision missile weapons. Both U.S. and Cuban officials assessed that no nuclear weapons are on board the submarine. But it is believed that the ships are capable of deploying various weapon systems for use in long-range missions. It has anti-submarine warfare, and they carry surface-to-surface and surface-to-air missiles. They're going to remain in Havana for a few more days, and actually Cubans can tour one of the ships themselves. It's a little tourist trap over there. In return, a U.S. submarine has arrived in Guantanamo Bay in our own show of force. The U.S. has said that the stop is part of a, quote, routine port visit as the submarine travels through the Southern Command's region. They actually said that in a social media post. Good use of Twitter, guys. Cuba, for its part, is experiencing its worst economic crisis in decades, and it's become increasingly reliant on Russian oil and on humanitarian aid. The arrival of these ships demonstrate, of course, a show of force. And as a reminder, Cuba is just 90 miles away from the United States. Both Cuban and American officials have remarked that the naval visits to Cuba are standard practice, though the ship's arrival comes at a maybe tense moment after President Biden has authorized Ukraine to use U.S.-provided weapons and strikes within Russian territory just a few weeks ago. Okay, Bishop, I'm going to turn it first to you. Is this something we need to be concerned about? Is this a real show of force? What is Russia? Is this just a routine visit? What is Russia trying to signal to us?
I mean, I think we should always take these types of moves seriously. This kind of goes back to our previous discussion about the EU on Wednesday, where we said we should, kind of take a breath and pump the brakes a little bit and not be alarmist about these things. But at the same time, we really do need to take them seriously and ensure that our response is both strategic and tactical. It meets the moment and that it shows that we are serious about their movements. That said, I think Russia is dealing with us on two fronts. One, domestically, they're dealing with fresh U.S. sanctions that have really placed their economy kind of in some upheaval. In response, the Russian government suspended the trading of the U.S. dollar and the euro, and that is completely just created chaos for people who are making rushes to banks in order to try to get U.S. dollars in hand before it's too late. So domestically, that is something they're dealing with. And as we've said on the podcast before, as I've said, and I think others have as well, a part of Putin's strength domestically is his ability to project power internationally, or at least seem as though have the veneer of the ability to project power internationally. And I think that is in part what we're seeing in some of this. It creates we're sitting here talking about it. So it creates at least a moment for him to draw away from his own domestic ills, at the same time showing that Russia is an international power, that they have the ability to really interact in the geopolitical sphere. Whether or not this actually comes down to some type of kinetic activity, I think I'm bullish on that. I don't think that's something that's actually going to happen. However, I think it's important for us being the United States, to really review the issue as it stands and have the proper response to it, and to not overplay our hand or to not give this too much legitimacy in the movement he's taking. I think it needs to be kind of really reviewed and analyzed properly, and then present movements accordingly. And I think, lastly, I know I'm kind of rambling on, but I think lastly, the movement of a U.S. ship into the area, I think it was the Helena, is important. Now, whether we say, it's kind of a convenient timing or, if that's the case, sure. But I think it's important for us to have that move there.
Les, what's your take? We've got Russian ships here 90 miles off the U.S. We talk a lot about other adversarial nation states' growing influence within the Western Hemisphere. You just, if you guys didn't attend, there was an NSI event on the, revival of the Monroe Doctrine and U.S. interests in Latin America. You spoke at that, you moderated that event, Les. Like, what's your take on this story?
Great topic, Jones. I largely agree with Bishop on the kind of the Moscow question. I think further, if this is Russia's response to the U.S. in allowing, if you will, if that's the right verb, the U.S. allowing and encouraging Ukraine to strike a little bit more inside Russian territory in order to defeat Russian supply lines in the war in the eastern and part of Ukraine and in Crimea, this is a pretty lame response. This is something that has happened every few years. It's international waters. There's no real threat to the United States, as the U.S. Navy pointed out. So if this is all Vladimir Putin is capable of mustering, I think that's evidence of a pretty weak hand on his part. So it's not a real Monroe Doctrine issue per se, but there is a larger Monroe Doctrine issue that I think has been not terrifically addressed by the administration. And it's not the threat from Russia, it's the threat from China, which is increasing its ties to all kinds of countries in Latin America. There's a big base being built by China in South America that we should be way more concerned about than this particular issue. Its economic ties are becoming more and more extensive. There are a whole bunch of Latin American countries whose primary trading partner is China. That should be a concern to us. So that's the real threat in the region. And further this, and then one final thought. This idea that Cubans are going on the Russian ships as some sort of tourist phenomenon just kind of shows you the pathetic and sad state of the Cuban Revolution. The freedom-loving peoples of Cuba and Russia are there tourist opportunities to go on each other's warships. Really, that's what's happening now here in 2024. So I don't know if this is a particularly fun Friday as much as it is a slightly ridiculous Friday.
Turn my last fun into a fun question when it's dealing with economic crisis in Cuba. But Les, we talked a little. What's the long play for Cuba? What is U.S. policy when it comes to Cuba? When, if ever, and I'll put it in American tourism terms, will we be going to Havana?
I think when we can have a real exchange of policy outcomes. In other words, the U.S. can relax the economic sanctions on Cuba when we see real change in Cuba on democracy and human rights issues. Right now, it's basically a tropical totalitarian state. There is no freedom. People are arrested for arbitrary reasons.
Tropical totalitarian.
Tropical totalitarianism. Yeah, it's a little
state.
Yeah, they do have some interesting, really old cars because they can't buy any new ones. Yes. There should be tourism. I don't think there should be any tourism right now, frankly, in Cuba. But at some point, when we see real respect for human rights and democracy in Cuba and a significant move in that direction, then I think we can start letting up. That should be the trade. We'll give you economic investment in exchange for these reforms.
I'm not disagreeing before I say this, but I want to just push the point. Like, are we going to be able to find that without at least coming to the table and having some type of normalized relations with them? And a part of the problem is the rhetoric on the more conservative sides that don't want any type of interaction at this point right now. I mean, I agree with you that I think we need to see gains in human rights, but how do we get there if we're not even willing to have the conversations that come to the table right now?
Well, I happen to agree with the right-wing conservatives when they criticize the regime in Havana. It's dictatorial, it's totalitarian, it is freedom-crushing. Yeah, and let's be clear. A lot of those folks in that community have a much more personal and detailed understanding of what's happening on the island than we do. It gets complex. And perhaps there's some vested interest. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And so I think that they actually do have a more nuanced position than it might seem from the outside. They are concerned about the welfare of relatives and friends who remain on the island and that kind of thing. And that's a real issue. And you can have some exchanges. Yes. What I'm saying is let's not send kind of naive American tourists to Cuba to celebrate the Viva la Revolucion, and instead look for real reform.
Yeah, and clearly this could be a whole nother podcast episode by itself. I agree wholeheartedly. I'm just trying to think through, like, what is going to be that point? What's that pivot point in which we can say, yes, they are totalitarian. Yes, this is terrible. Yes, they have human rights issues that we want to address, and we need to figure out a way to bring them to the table to do exactly that and to have these conversations. Because right now it seems like it's complete.
That was going to be my follow-up. I was going to ask Bishop. I was like, Bishop, accepting Les's, ideas for the future, what would you think would be the timetable for these reforms happening, for actual change taking place? So that I was going to ask you what the time
for
period,
me, for Les,
what that would be, because I was going to have you predict on Les's. I
have no idea, because I agree with him, because I think it is very nuanced and is very personal for a lot of the discourse around it, for a lot of the elected officials particularly, but for a lot of the discourse around it. And I'm not trying to take away from that, but I do think within it depends on who's in charge of the country from the White House in the next after the next election, what we could potentially see there, and it still depends on Congress a lot too. So I maybe a decade.
Bishop, I will say, did any of us think Donald Trump was going to go try to cut a deal with Kim Jong-un? No, we did not. Nor do I think that was a great idea. That's another podcast that we. Well, it didn't work. It didn't work. Is he going to go try and do it with the successors to the Castro brothers? Maybe. Is it going to work? Probably not.
It depends on who his vice president is too, I think. So it depends on a lot.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Excellent point.
Yeah.
Excellent point.
Wow. See, you guys, I knew it would be a fun Friday. We just dangled a little over there. Viva la Resolution. All right. Okay. Thanks, guys. That's a wrap. Thanks to Devlin Burney and Emma Semeth. And Claude Jennings and the entire NSI team for the help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Monday, June 17th for another episode of Fault Lines, NSI's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. We're on YouTube. Check out our faces and Bishop's fun shirt there. And Les's seizure-inducing fan if you really want to get into it. And if you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Have a wonderful weekend.